Forget the cops. Forget the wiretaps. Forget the grand gotcha moment that people keep imagining. If there's one person who exposed Tony Soprano first, it wasn't law enforcement, and it definitely wasn't some brave whistleblower. It was Christopher Moltisanti, because subtlety is not one of his life skills. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Meadow didn't need a confession to start seeing what her father really was. She needed one reckless cousin who couldn't keep his mouth shut, one conversation, one panic reaction, one accidental slip that turns Tony from strict dad into something much more specific. A man adults fear like it's policy. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Not the violence people talk about. Violence is easy to dismiss as exaggeration. The real giveaway is the way Christopher reacts to Tony's name. The instant deference, the sudden terror, the tone that says, this isn't family discipline. This is command and control. So if the question is, who exposed Tony first? The answer isn't dramatic. It's worse. It's personal. It's inside the house. And it starts with the one guy who treats secrecy like a hobby he keeps forgetting to practice. Now watch what happens the moment Meadow asks for a simple favor, and Christopher turns it into a full-scale revelation. Christopher Moltisanti's most reliable talent is converting secrecy into casual conversation. In a culture where discretion is a job requirement and euphemism is a dialect, he treats incriminating details like garnish. This is not simply a personal defect, it is a structural hazard. Meadow Soprano does not need a wiretap, a confession, or a grand moral epiphany to start seeing what her father is. She needs one impulsive relative, close enough in age to speak without the stiff ceremony reserved for older people. The pattern begins with adolescent logic, the kind that thrives in private schools and comfortable homes. A teenage girl wants stimulants, and the closest route is a cousin reputed to have connections. Meadow and her friend do not approach him like a senior figure in an organized enterprise. They approach him like the family's messy liability, the cousin who always seems to know someone who knows someone. The expectation is simple. Christopher and his equally reckless companion are the sort of young men with questionable judgment. Christopher refuses, and for a brief moment, the audience is allowed to imagine he has discovered a conscience. Meadow's surprise is less entitlement than recalibration. The version of Christopher she expects would have said yes out of carelessness, bravado, or the juvenile thrill of playing the outlaw. Instead, he stops her. And then, because competence cannot survive long in his hands, he explains why with catastrophic candor. He does not deliver a responsible warning about health, legality, or self-restraint. He blurts the hierarchy. The message is not, this is dangerous, but this is above your pay grade, complete with the implied enforcement mechanism. If the goal were to keep Meadow in the dark, Christopher's mouth is the wrong tool for the job. From that moment, Meadow's perception shifts from vague suspicion to emotional evidence. Tony's influence becomes visible not through direct admission, but through other people's fear. Christopher, who otherwise performs toughness and resents authority as if resentment were a career plan, snaps into reflexive deference at the mere thought of Tony. The contrast is impossible to miss. Meadow may not draft an organizational chart, but she can read posture and tone. She can read the difference between an overprotective father and a man whose anger functions as a governing principle for adults. The lesson lands again when Christopher later confronts Meadow with frantic hostility, accusing her of talking to Tony and behaving as though she has weaponized her father's power against him. His intensity is not the irritation of a cousin caught misbehaving. It is panic. It is the terror of a subordinate who believes a boss may retaliate, and it is performed in front of the boss's daughter. Meadow does not need to understand the internal rules of the crew to recognize what that fear implies. If Tony were merely strict, Christopher would be annoyed. He is terrified. That distinction matters. There is always an attempt to deflate this. Threatening violence is not exclusive to organized crime. Any responsible adult might warn a teenager that a furious parent could respond brutally to someone pushing dangerous drugs. True, and also irrelevant. The line is not incriminating because it mentions violence. It is incriminating because it treats violence as routine enforcement. Many parents may say, in a moment of rage, that they would kill someone who harmed their child. Few parents are spoken about as if murder were a realistic workplace policy. Christopher's warning is not moral outrage. It is procedural. Christopher's loose tongue also shapes how Meadow reads Tony's social orbit. Older figures like Polly and Silvio can pass, at least at first, as quirky blue-collar uncles in a vaguely defined business. They are older, more practiced, and often more careful in front of children because they have learned the utility of controlled impressions. Christopher is different. He is close enough to Meadow's generation that he drops the ceremonial distance older men keep around family. He talks to her as though she is already initiated, or at least as though she is old enough not to require the performance. In other words, he treats her like a peer when he should treat her like a liability. And then he is shocked when she starts noticing what peers notice. The car subplot makes the same point with louder props. Davy Scatino's collapse is the kind of tragedy the story relishes. A man who thinks he can gamble with predators and then looks shocked when the water turns red. His surrender of a valuable car as partial repayment is grimly sensible, a desperate liquidation for breathing room. The absurdity arrives when Tony takes that asset and uses it not to stabilize his own household, but to advertise dominance inside it. Rather than quietly converting the car into cash and buying Meadow anything else, he delivers the trophy directly into the family garage, in full view of the very social dynamics it will rupture. It is a dominance display masquerading as generosity. This is often described as a crazy move, and it is, if Tony is supposed to behave like a rational provider. He is not. He is a man who needs the evidence of his power to be visible. He wants Davy humiliated, certainly, but he also wants Meadow forced into proximity with the truth. Therapy offers the label, unconscious motivation. The less flattering description is needling. Tony cannot tolerate the fantasy that Meadow's comfort floats free of the violence and exploitation that fund it. If she is going to live well, she must, in his mind, accept the source without flinching. Not because it is right, but because her flinching reads as judgment. His language gives him away. He hears phrases from others, adopts them, and then deploys them later as if repetition launders meaning. Someone complains about holier-than-thou behavior. Tony later uses the same concept to swat away Meadow's discomfort, framing her ethics as pretension. The irony is not accidental. The man who profits from predation accuses his daughter of moral vanity because she does not immediately celebrate stolen property. Tony's moral vocabulary exists to win arguments, not to correct conduct. It is a rhetorical mugging. This is why the most coherent reading of Tony's relationship with his children is not that he wants them protected, but that he wants them complicit. Meadow is not written as a saintly foil. She is written as an intelligent young woman skilled at cognitive dissonance. She can talk about injustice in polished academic language and then defend her family's world when that world pays her tuition. She is capable of disgust and justification in the same breath. The character is not contradictory. She is accurate. Privilege does not remove moral conflict. It trains moral conflict to become selective. Complaints that Meadow is spoiled and ungrateful are understandable but incomplete. She is spoiled. She is also pressured. Achievement is the household's respectable currency, the mask that makes the money feel earned. When Meadow experiments with drugs and alcohol, it is not a shocking hypocrisy. It is a predictable symptom of high expectations paired with limited consequences. The speed use in her academic years is not sophistication. It is self-medication in a system that rewards performance over well-being. then congratulates itself for producing success. That tension clarifies the early drug subplot that invites confusion. Why does Christopher give Meadow methamphetamine at all? Why not refuse outright? Why not tell Tony and earn credit for protecting the boss's daughter? The answer is not that meth was harmless, nor that Christopher was noble. The answer is that he is a coward who understands the street better than the suburbs. He knows Meadow is stubborn. He knows she may seek drugs elsewhere. He also knows that naive teenagers wandering into a rough neighborhood with cash are easy targets for theft, assault, and worse. His solution is not to prevent the behavior. It is to control it, to keep her away from the worst possibilities, while keeping himself insulated from immediate blowback. There is also a practical historical point. Certain contemporary threats that now dominate drug panic were not framed the same way in that era, and the show reflects that, but the deeper reason remains character-based. Christopher tries to reduce risk by controlling supply, not by eliminating desire. He chooses the compromise that protects him from immediate blame, and protects Meadow from immediate street danger, while leaving the underlying problem untouched. It is not parenting. It is risk management performed by a man who should not be entrusted with a houseplant, let alone a teenager's safety. The question of why he does not tell Tony has the same cowardly answer. Reporting the approach admits exposure on Christopher's watch. It invites Tony to punish the breach and to punish the man closest to it. Christopher's loyalty is never so pure that it overrides his instinct to avoid blame. He chooses concealment because concealment is safer for him than honesty. It is also why his mouth later betrays him. He hides the act, then blurts the structure. Self-preservation in this world tends to be clumsy. This clumsiness feeds into the longer question of Tony's coldness toward Christopher. There is a sentimental impulse to insist Tony treats Christopher like a son. The more accurate description is that Tony treats him like an heir he does not trust, and a subordinate he feels entitled to humiliate. Tony's gaze rarely carries warmth. It carries assessment. He uses Christopher as labor, as continuity, and as a convenient target for frustration. The relationship is not built on care. It is built on ownership. Love, such as it exists, is the kind that feels uncomfortably similar to possession. Psychological explanations are available, and the story supplies them without demanding pity. Tony did not grow up with healthy models of affection. His caregivers were manipulative, violent, and emotionally stunted. Support came with debt. Criticism came with humiliation. It is unsurprising that Tony reproduces what he learned. It is also not excusing it. Having no template does not prevent learning one. It merely requires effort. Tony devotes enormous effort to preserving power and comfort, and minimal effort to developing emotional competence. Priorities are character. This is why the argument that Tony kills Christopher for logistical reasons never fully holds. The act reads less like reluctant executive management and more like personal disposal. Earlier killings can be framed as rage, panic, or grief. This one feels calculated, cold, and disturbingly serene. The same man who undermined Christopher's sobriety with mockery and temptation suddenly adopts the pose of the concerned leader tightening the ship. The performance is transparent. The real motive is not operational discipline. It is elimination of a problem that has become emotionally inconvenient. Tony's later behavior reinforces the reading. His posture at the funeral is not sorrowful. It is self-absorbed. Justifications appear, but they arrive after the fact, like paperwork. The moral logic is retrofitted. If the priority were truly sobriety and stability, the earlier sabotage would be inexplicable. But cruelty is rarely consistent, and Tony's cruelty is consistent only in one way. It serves his appetite, his ego, and his need to avoid responsibility. By the later seasons, Tony's decline is less a slide than a consolidation. A particularly revealing moment occurs when he provokes Janice after she shows signs of improvement. Her anger management is not a miracle, but it is progress, and Tony cannot tolerate it. He needles her until she explodes, then watches with satisfaction as the familiar chaos returns. It is a precise demonstration of his addiction to misery. Other people's growth feels like an accusation. He can cope only when others are dragged down to his level, where he can feel normal by comparison. Other low points underline the same entitlement. Tony contemplating violence against Hesh, a long-standing lender and confidant, reveals how quickly loyalty becomes negotiable when Tony's sense of ownership is challenged. Hesh is not a stranger. He is a relationship Tony has used as a moral foil and a source of validation. Considering turning on him is the ethical equivalent of dismantling the last support beam because it is inconvenient. When even the oldest ties become expendable, the message is simple. Nothing is sacred. Everything is inventory. The series also invites, and engineers, endless debate about its ending. The cut to black can be read as Tony's death. The suspicious figure in a members-only jacket, the repeated point-of-view glances, the season's emphasis on not hearing it coming, and motifs like bells punctuating scenes. It can also be read as the audience's expulsion. The story ends because access ends, not because the character necessarily stops breathing in that instant. Both readings have enough textual support to sustain essays, and enough ambiguity to ensure no essay ever wins. Some readings treat the diner as an inverted sacrament, a last supper for a man cast as anti-heroic messiah, betrayal in the air, damnation waiting behind an ordinary door. The appeal is obvious. It flatters the interpreter and dresses a criminal's end in mythic clothing. The corrective is equally obvious. This is still a series that delights in puncturing grand narratives with mundane realities. If the ending has a theology, it is an unromantic one. Consequences do not need thunder. They arrive in booths and courtrooms. Yet the most practical conclusion is that Tony's life is finished either way. A bullet ends it. A prosecution ends it. A long prison sentence drains it. The finale's discipline is that it frames all outcomes as the same moral endpoint. A man who believed probability would keep sparing him finally runs out of narrative room. After surviving multiple attempts, he begins to behave as though the percentages must now favor him, the gambler's fallacy dressed as confidence. Whether the end is gunfire or handcuffs, the point is the same. The fantasy of control collapses. If this sounds relentlessly heavy, the series has always balanced brutality with language sharp enough to sting and amuse at once. Dialogue becomes memory because it compresses entire personalities into casual exchanges. A therapist suggests that a patient's thoughts have an Eastern flavor, and the patient replies that he has lived in New Jersey his whole life. In 2 lines, the show punctures spiritual posturing and provincial stubbornness. After a suicide attempt, a clinician calls it a cry for help, and the response reframes it with blunt literalism. The humor lands because it is inseparable from pain, and the characters cannot survive without turning pain into argument. The persistence of obscure lines is not trivia. It is evidence of craft. A bland demand to sit down becomes a threat because the room is saturated with power. A deadpan line about being happy, delivered in a context where happiness is clearly not the objective, reveals how politeness is used as a weapon. A ludicrous cover story about a woman drowning at a picnic is funny because it is told with straight-faced commitment, a lie elevated to performance art. The show's dialogue endures because it exposes how people use language to dominate, to deflect, and to avoid ever saying what they mean. The same tonal dexterity appears in the affectionately annoyed complaints about realism. The show's least plausible element is not the occasional hairpiece, though that certainly becomes its own punchline. The deeper unreality is how often violence evaporates without consequence. The pilot's broad daylight assault in a busy office park is particularly brazen, the sort of early series grandstanding later refined into something more disciplined. The show is not pretending to be a police procedural. It is staging moral truth, not forensic paperwork. Still, even within its own frame, certain acts feel too public, too clean, too consequence-free to fully pass as lived reality. The comedy of least realistic moments continues in smaller domestic absurdities. Watching Tony play a video game with one hand while maintaining a posture of intimidating masculinity is funny precisely because it is so ordinary. The boss is still a man trying to look impressive while doing something mildly ridiculous. The image of AJ resetting an entire race by shutting down the console is equally perfect. A petty act of adolescent control disguised as incompetence. The joke is that privilege does not produce competence. It often produces shortcuts. A smaller realism complaint stands. Tony behaves like consequences are optional, yet the narrative does not make him pay in disease or other children. When the story turns to the children, the question becomes less about plausibility and more about inheritance. Why does AJ crumble while Meadow climbs? Because the same environment produces different coping strategies, and the parents reward one strategy while undermining the other. Meadow is conventionally driven and therefore easy to praise. AJ is searching, inconsistent, and therefore easy to ridicule. He is protected from the details of his father's work, but not from the consequences of living under its shadow. Intimidation without competence, entitlement without purpose, and a persistent sense that life is being done to him rather than built by him. AJ's malaise also reads as generational portraiture. Surrounded by comfort and yet alienated, he flirts with politics and moral causes as a substitute for direction, absorbing the anxieties of the era without acquiring the discipline to act. The series treats him with satire and sympathy, and the audience's impatience often reveals a fantasy that the son of a powerful man should be powerful. The show refuses. It insists that privilege can produce drift as readily as it produces ambition, and that parenting built on money and avoidance can still fail spectacularly. All of this loops back to the series' central talent, exposing how people know and do not know at the same time. Meadow senses the truth early, then compartmentalizes it when convenient. Carmela understands enough to be complicit, then performs innocence when she wants to feel clean. Tony demands loyalty, then violates it whenever appetite requires. Christopher begs for approval, then sabotages himself before anyone else can. The system runs on partial truths, selective attention, and the social utility of pretending not to notice what everyone already senses. In that ecosystem, Christopher remains the most embarrassing accelerant. Surrounded by older men who understand the value of silence when it matters, he behaves as if discretion were an insult rather than a necessity. He speaks too freely, reacts too loudly, and treats the family's euphemisms as optional decoration. He inadvertently strips the haze from Meadow's eyes, and he does it not out of principle, but out of incompetence. The tragedy is not only that he is weak, it is that he is predictable, the kind of liability that makes everyone else look smart. Risk reduction isn't morality. Subscribe.